The National Guard has been deployed in Washington, D.C. under orders from President Donald Trump. Is this an effective way to reduce crime? Welcome to Sharpening Arrows, where we train teens to think biblically about life and politics. I'm your host, Victor Jakes. Well, I am very pleased to announce that this podcast is now a video podcast. Assuming I have the technical know-how, not necessarily a safe assumption. This podcast will be on youtube.com/@ sharpening arrows. youtube.com/@ sharpening arrows. Now, I can't promise any technical wizardry, but if you want to watch instead of listen, now you can. And if you are joining us for the first time, welcome. The name Sharpening Arrows is a reference to a couple of verses in the Bible. The first is Proverbs 27:17, as iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. That's the sharpening part. And then we get to the arrows. It's a reference to Psalms 127:4. Like arrows in the hands of a warrior are sons and daughters born in one's youth. Blessed is the man and woman whose quiver is full of them. And teenagers, that's what we as parents want to do. We want to prepare you to launch out into the world as arrows. But of course, an arrow doesn't do anyone any good if it isn't sharp. And that's what this podcast is for, is to help you sharpen your critical thinking skills. We're going to be thinking through issues in life and politics. A lot of politics, but we will talk about some life issues as well. Now, there's something else that's unusual about this podcast or this video podcast, whatever you call that. There are going to be questions throughout the podcast that I would encourage you to stop and discuss, because this podcast isn't just for one person. Obviously, you're welcome to listen to it by yourself, but it's really meant for parents and teens or preteens to listen to together and discuss. That's the most important thing. Parents, you are your child's most important teacher. Go through and discuss these issues. And teenagers, this is really an invitation to discuss. You are free to disagree with me and your parents. Now, disagreeing doesn't mean you're right, but you have to decide what you believe. And parents, I would encourage you to not be upset if your preteen or teenager disagrees. That's proof they are engaging and thinking about these issues. Now, of course, I would encourage you to prod their positions with questions, whatever they believe. Make them own it. Make them think about it themselves. And of course, we always want to cover our kids in prayer. Now, if you're someone who feels very confident in your beliefs, that's great. I would encourage you to attempt to argue for the side that you disagree with. Now, that's a great way to test the strength of your arguments and your beliefs, and you can see the strengths and weaknesses of each side. As we discussed in the very first episode, which I am going to try and record as a video for YouTube, but there are good arguments for bad ideas. That doesn't make the bad idea good, but there can be good arguments for bad ideas. And in fact, I'm going to be re-recording the first 7 episodes and add in an 8th episode, and those are going to be foundational episodes that we will refer back to. So if you are new, please go and check those out. All right, let's get into the topic for today. This is from the Associated Press. Last week, Donald Trump said he would take over the Washington, D.C.'s police department in hopes of reducing crime. Even as city officials stressed that crime is already falling. The District of Columbia's status as a congressionally established federal district allows the president to take control, although he's limited to 30 days under statute unless he gets approval from Congress. Now, a recent court ruling has limited Trump's ability to directly run the department. The D.C. police chief is still in charge, but the White House is basically running the show. Now, why would Trump do this? Well, it's simple. Crime in the nation's capital is out of control. There have been reports from media members, congressional staffers, and even members of Congress who have been assaulted. And of course, it's not just limited to them. This summer, Eric Tapanin-Jakin, a 21-year-old congressional intern, died after being shot in D.C. Can you imagine that? In the middle of likely your college career, you go to the District of Columbia to work as a congressional intern, and you die in a random and horrible act of violence. Now, there's currently a scandal about DC police leaders underreporting crime statistics, but murder is hard to hide. And last year, the homicide rate in DC was 27.3 per 100,000 residents. That is almost double the murder rate in Bogota, Colombia, and nearly triple the rate in Mexico City. Now, those are cities most Americans would consider unsafe, and yet statistically, you're more likely to die in Washington, D.C. Now, there is this claim that crime is dropping, but there are a couple of problems here. The first, as I mentioned, there are concerns about police higher-ups manipulating data. And the second is that while declining crime is good, it's simply not as much of an accomplishment if you are starting at a high baseline. Think of it this way. Imagine you were 7 days late with an assignment. Not great. Now, the next assignment, you were 6 days late. And imagine going to your parents and saying, look, lateness is really on the decline. It's down by 16%. Do you think your parents are buying that? No, because you were still really late. And we still have high crime in Washington, D.C., and in many other big cities around the country. Now, obviously, with issues like this, there are often many, many factors. We're going to hone in on just one in a vain attempt to keep this podcast under 20 minutes. I have to say, with my new setup, I can't actually see the time. So beware. We might be pushing 35 minutes. But what we're gonna look at today is there are two often kind of main ways to think about fixing crime. One is the idea of addressing the root causes of crime, preventing it from even happening. And the second is to boost the presence of police and increase the sentences for criminals. Now let's have a pause point right here. Which way do you think is better? Should we primarily address root causes or boost policing and sentencing? All right, I hope you've given an answer. And now I want you to make an argument for the other side. Stretch yourself. See if you can think about why someone would disagree with you. Now, on this video podcast, we start with the arguments for the side that I personally disagree with. And so I consider it the wrong side. If you disagree with me, that's fine. I'm not going to be offended. So let's start for the arguments for the primary focus of officials should be addressing root causes. Argument number one. Well, let's consider the grade 8. Those are 8 questions that we ask when we are considering policy issues. Question number 3 is there a principle involved? Well, there sure is. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. That's why we're getting at the root cause. Because if we can get at the root cause, we can prevent the crime from happening. We can keep someone out of the criminal justice system where they're simply going to learn how to be a better criminal. That's better for everyone because, first of all, there's no crime that's been committed. Second of all, it's cheaper. Jail is very expensive. Sending people to court is very expensive. And so what we need to do is simply fix the situation so that people aren't committing crimes. Now, Washington, D.C. has been trying this approach. In 2020, NBC Washington reported, quote, the D.C. Council passed a budget slashing $15 million from the Metropolitan Police Department, despite Mayor Muriel Bowser's objections. The budget adds millions of dollars for social service programs, and some of the funds that were cut will fund violence interrupters who work in communities with at-risk youth. You see, smaller problems are easier to deal with. We need to focus on prevention, not beefing up the response. Argument 2. This is how you would want to be treated, especially if you were a kid. And this is focusing more on the sentencing portion. DC's Attorney General Brian Schwab in 2023 said, quote, "We also are committed in the juvenile system to treat kids like kids, and that we give kids what the law requires, which is a chance of rehabilitation and going on to live lives of success and independence." Again, this is DC's Attorney General. Kids are different than adults, and our job as the Attorney General of the city is to keep the city safe, but also make sure we stay true to our obligation to young people. I think we can all agree there's a difference between an adult and a child. And children, they have a chance to learn, they have a chance to correct. They don't have to be sucked into this life of crime. Think about when you were a child. Think about the silly things that you did, the wrong things that you did. Would you want that to have branded you for the rest of your life? And that's why DC has the Youth Rehabilitation Act, which allows judges to ignore mandatory minimum sentences for criminals under 25. Argument number 3. Aggressive policing leads to disproportionate arrest of young African Americans. In the Bureau of Prisons, now this is not the District of Columbia, but the Bureau of Prisons nationwide, same principle here. 38% of inmates are black. Now, the U.S. population is only around 12 to 13% African American. This is simply another example of systemic racism. Now, as we think about those arguments, let me tell you about Mama Bear Prayers, a podcast for moms who are knee-deep in dishes and training their teens. Whether you are in the carpool lane or the coffee line, host Charity Rios wants to come alongside you and help you grow deeper in your relationship with Jesus. Now, as every parent knows, raising kids can feel a bit like a ping pong game. You bounce from moments of joy to moments of deepest concern. Combined with the busyness of life, especially now that school has started or is about to start, this back and forth can lead moms feeling overwhelmed and even isolated. And Charity knows this firsthand because she's the mom of 4 very busy boys. And that's why she created Mama Bear Prayers, to support moms who are on the journey of raising kids. God works through prayer, so pray alongside Charity and check out Mama Bear Prayers today. All right, so let's start with a rebuttal to those arguments, and we'll have another pause point here. Which of the great 8 applies to these arguments? And just so you remember, let's go through them. Question 1, what happens next? Question 2, has this been tried before? Question 3, is there a principle involved? Question 4, what are the trade-offs? Question 5, what do you mean by that? Question 6, is this an appeal to emotion or logic? Question 7, am I focused on the speaker or the argument? And question 8, what does the Bible say? We are putting those questions in our mental toolbox to help us address issues like this one. And remember, just because I didn't select the question that you did doesn't mean your question is wrong. There are lots of ways to attack these arguments, but I'm going to walk you through how I would do it. All right, we have this argument about an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And this is one of the reasons that we have question 2, has this been tried before? Because if you just stay in the theoretical world, this argument sounds pretty good. I think there's actually a lot of appeal to it, and we're going to talk about in a little bit about why it doesn't work in this case, but there is truth to this principle that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. But that's why we have to take our ideas and look at them and see how they worked in the real world. Well, we know how this is working because as I read, right, 2020, DC cut police funding and they tried these violence interrupters, the social work programs, and now we can look at the crime statistics, and it's not working. So no matter how good it sounds in theory, if we take it into the real world and it doesn't work, something's wrong. and we've got to go back and look at the theoretical argument. Now, I would suggest here that the problem isn't the principle, but the focus. What lowers crime isn't somehow making crime unappealing through social work programs. What lowers crime are two-parent married families raising kids, and religious convictions. There's a reason the founders talked about how the government of our nation was made for a religious people. Religious convictions bring self-restraint, and then you need less of an outside force restraining people like the law. All right, let's look at this question too. Oh man, I looked at the time. This is trouble, not being able to see the time. I'm going to try and keep it under 30 minutes here. All right, let's look at question 2 or point 2 here. How would you want to be treated? Well, of course, a criminal wants to have it easy. But let's look at question 3. And I'm going to have a pause point here. Is there a principle involved? What do you think? Is there a principle involved in how a criminal is punished? And I would suggest absolutely there is. It's justice for the victim. It's justice. It's making right the wrong that was done. The point of the justice system isn't to rehabilitate someone. Now, if we can do that, that's fantastic. Obviously, we don't want people to be career criminals. But the point of the court system and the very idea of justice is to punish for the wrong that happened. And so there is a principle involved here, and it's not how would you want to be treated if you did the wrong thing. It's what is just for the victim of the crime. All right, this third point, this third argument, aggressive policing leads to disproportionate outcomes. And I'm really going to have to refer you back to our last episode for a more detailed discussion here. But the short version is that if you judge people based on their choices, you will almost always get disproportionate results for factors that aren't directly connected to that choice. And for someone who says, well, we have this huge problem because there's this wildly disproportionate population of people in the prison system compared to the general population. What's your alternative? Are you going to tell the victim of a crime, hey, I'm sorry, we can't arrest the person who committed this crime? We know he's guilty. We know he'd be found guilty by a jury. But you see, our justice system is based on maintaining the right racial proportions of criminals. No. We should judge individuals based on their actions, not focus on group identities. All right, let's talk about arguments for the correct side, which I believe to be strong policing and strong sentences for those who commit crimes. And let's look at this question of what happens next. That's question 1 in the grade 8. Very important question. And let's have a pause point. What happens when criminals realize they'll receive a slap on the wrist for their crimes? I'd encourage you to really pause the podcast and discuss it. Here's what happens. When criminals realize they aren't being punished, they commit more crimes. We've seen this especially with shoplifting in places like New York City, where someone will be arrested for shoplifting and they'll be out in an hour or two because New York City doesn't have cash bail and they don't actually punish people for shoplifting. And you will have people committing hundreds of shoplifting offenses again and again and again because they realize there's actually nothing stopping me here, and they don't have that internal moral conviction that you would get from a belief in something like Christianity. And then there's another problem. The people around them in the community realize that actually, crime does pay, and you actually end up with more criminals. You end up in a destructive spiral. Now, what happens when you arrest criminals and send them to jail? Well, the first thing is that person cannot commit another crime. Wow, that's a win right there. You have someone who was committing crimes and now they're in jail and they aren't committing crimes. That's a good thing for the society. And then there's another benefit. Other people look around and they realize, oh, if I do that, I'm going to go to jail. I don't want to go to jail. I better not do that. You see, criminals respond to incentives as well. All right, point 2 about why we should have strong policing and send criminals to jail. Let's ask this question number 2. Has this been tried before? Let's have a pause point here and apply it in your own life. And parents, this is a tough one. Trust me, as the parent of 7 kids, this is a tough one. But teens, what happens when you or a sibling realize your parents aren't enforcing a rule they've laid out? I can tell you what happens in my house. They very often start breaking the rule. And we've seen this play out in cities around the country, most noticeably in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. has tried the lax on crime method. It simply hasn't worked. And then we can look at other places. Look at New York City. New York City had a very high rate of crime in the 1980s. And then came a crackdown led by then Mayor Rudy Giuliani and many others. There's a National Bureau of Economic Research summarized a study in an article entitled "What Reduced Crime in New York City?" This is a quote from it. Felony arrest rates, except for motor vehicle thefts, rose 50 to 70% in the 1990s. That is a massive jump. When arrest of burglars increased 10%, the number of burglaries fell 2.7 to 3.2%. When the arrest rate of robbers rose 10%, the number of robberies fell 5.7 to 5.9%. In the case of murder, the decline was 3.9 to 4%. In the case of assault, it was around 2%. And for motor vehicle theft, around 5%. That was just for arrest. Between 1990 and 1999, homicide dropped 73%, burglary 66%, assault 40%, robbery 67%, and vehicle hoist 73%. Wow, that is a major, major drop in crime. And what did they do? They arrested people and sent them to jail. All right, argument number 3. Let's look at this question number 8. What does the Bible say? Now, you could talk about this a ton. And I'm not going to pretend that this is a comprehensive overview, especially of the differences between the Old Testament and the New Testament. But look at how justice is laid out in the Bible when it comes to what the government's responsibility is. Not necessarily your responsibility as a Christian, but the government's responsibility and the role of the government. Government doesn't provide rehabilitation, but a consequence for the wrong that is done. There is a famous passage in the Bible that talks about whoever takes a human life shall surely be put to death. Whoever takes an animal's life shall make it good, life for life. If anyone injures his neighbor as he has done, it shall be done to him. A fracture for a fracture, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Whatever injury is given a person shall be given to him. Now, that's not just in the Bible. It's an ancient and common sentiment. The Code of Hammurabi is a famous, very old, ancient legal code. And it says, if anyone steal cattle or sheep or donkey or pig or goat, if it belong to a god or to the court, the thief shall pay 30-fold, therefore. If it belong to a freedman of the king, he shall pay 10-fold. And if the thief has nothing with which to pay, he shall be put to death. Now, I'm not recommending that for today, but you can simply see the principle there throughout the course of history. And so the takeaway today is that crime deserves punishment. And when you don't punish crime, society is punished with more crime. If you enjoyed this, please leave us a 5-star review. If you are on YouTube, there's some way to subscribe. If I figure out how to put the fancy little button in the corner, you can click there. Otherwise, I would certainly appreciate if you would subscribe. We'll be doing these videos on our normal schedule. So we're going to have an episode out by Monday morning, by Wednesday morning, and on Friday we have those short, pointed episodes. And I encourage you also, if you enjoy this, share it with your friends and Christian community. Stay sharp and give God the glory. I'll see you next time.